Here are the key points that I'll present in this video. The first point is that this pandemic is signified by the Saturn-Jupiter-Mars conjunction in Capricorn, which occurs in proximity to a southern solstice eclipse. The second point is that the pandemic will flare up whenever those three planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, have mutual contact in Capricorn. And conversely, the third point is it'll clear up when that's no longer possible. And it goes away when it becomes impossible and when the initial conditions are no longer met. The initial conditions are mostly Jupiter being in negative dignity and dominated by malefics in strong dignity. And that situation will start to occur over the course of 2021, but won't really reach full maturity until the beginning of 2022, when Jupiter gets out of Saturn's sign, gets into good dignity by entering Pisces. Coronavirus became known to the world at the end of 2019, in December, in connection with this eclipse. The salient features of this eclipse is that it occurs at the southern solstice with a debilitated benefic, in this case Jupiter. And it occurs shortly before the Saturn-Jupiter-Mars conjunction in a Saturn sign. In my video, Coronavirus and the Astrology of Pandemics, I examined this in detail and showed how fairly unique this is in history and how it matches very closely the signature onsets for the previous three major pandemics in recorded history: the Justian pandemic, Spanish flu pandemic, and the Black Plague pandemic. So just to really briefly bring that into this video, this is the Justian eclipse. You can see that it occurs at the southern solstice also, and with aspect from both malefics. And this is the eclipse for the Spanish flu. You can see that this also occurs at the southern solstice and has an aspect from a malefic Mars. The Black Plague's eclipse, this was a very long pandemic, so let's look at several of them. We have 1345, which is the root of it, where we had Saturn, Jupiter, Mars conjunction in a Saturn sign with the eclipse, just like this one. And then in 1347, when the pandemic went completely out of control, you have this eclipse with Saturn, the malefic. And then when the pandemic was at its full peak, you had the eclipse at the southern solstice with aspects from both malefics. So what I really want to take away as a brief, if you want more details on this, please look at the video, Coronavirus and the Astrology of Pandemics. In brief, what you should really realize is the conspiracy theories that this is not actually a pandemic are not supported by this analysis of astrology, unless you want to say that all the previous pandemics were also conspiracies. In another video, The Future of Coronavirus, I explained that all of these pandemics got their initial spark or flare when Mars transited the point of the foundational eclipse. And so that is also the case with what happened here with the coronavirus pandemic. Here you see the first outbreak, which now seems very small, but at the time was significant. In mid-February, you can see Mars is there at the K2 point. Now, it was in mid-March that we had the first wave of coronavirus. Take a look at this chart. This is where Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars finally achieved their conjunction. Now, in mid-April, we saw a plateau in the spread of coronavirus. I had actually predicted this at the end of my video, Did Anyone Actually Predict Coronavirus? At the end of the video, I made my own predictions for the future of it, where I had mentioned that the new moon in Ashvini would probably improve the situation. And what we see here in this transit in mid-April is that new moon in Ashwini, and also Mars now is separating from Jupiter and Saturn. That whole conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, Mars is now separated. You at least have a sign border in between Jupiter and Saturn, and you have Mars moving off. So it was during this time that the coronavirus kind of came a bit under control and things started to loosen up. The containment of the coronavirus started to break down in mid-May. Take a look at this transit, mid-May. What we have here is Jupiter and Saturn going retrograde and not wanting to disperse. Earlier in mid-April, we had the dispersal of this conjunction, but now they go retrograde in mid-May and start to reconjoin. And so it was because of that also at the end of that same video, did anyone actually predict coronavirus, that I predicted that it's not going to just go away with the Ashwini new moon. It would resurge in a wave. It would resurge, and we would probably get multiple waves of it, because when you have a retrogression over a point, it gets triggered 3 times. Now, mid-June, we were about midway through the spike of the second wave. And here we had the counterpoint eclipse to the original eclipse. So here we have the eclipse at the northern solstice. And you have Mars aspecting this eclipse. And you have Saturn aspecting Mars. And you have Jupiter and Saturn sign. So there's really no indication in this eclipse that the original conditions have changed. We still have a very tight integration of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. So sure enough, there's no improvement. There's no improvement at that time. However, by mid-July, we did get another plateau where we start to get things somewhat under control. So if you look at this transit, you see that now Mars has gotten out of its ability to aspect Jupiter and Saturn by Vedic aspect. By Vedic aspect, Mars has a square to the right, not to the left. Saturn has a square to the left. Mars influences 90 degrees, but not 270. So what we saw when the coronavirus started to subside a bit again in July is that the influence of Mars on Jupiter and Saturn waned. And additionally, we had another new moon in a health positive nakshatra. We had the new moon in Pusha. Coronavirus, however, saw a third wave come around October. This occurs simultaneous with Jupiter and Mars losing their retrogression. So the waves of the coronavirus seem to be following the retrogressions of Jupiter and Saturn. When they retrogress backwards, the second wave started, and then when they retrogress forward again, the third wave starts. But in addition, Mars has gone retrogress, so the planets are moving towards each other again. Saturn and Jupiter are moving forward, and Mars moving backwards. So Mars does begin to apply its Vedic aspect, because now its forward aspect is pointed to 270 degrees. So it starts to look at Jupiter and Saturn again, and you get this combined effect of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in Capricorn, which is really the hallmark of the whole coronavirus pandemic. Then finally, if we look at this upcoming transit on December 15th, which is a pretentious day for America as well, but that's a different subject. On the subject of coronavirus in particular, and by the way, the Jupiter being the debilitated planet here does heavily affect the United States, because the United States is a Jupiterian ascendant, Sagittarius. So anyway, now we have a repeat of the eclipse happening again at the southern solstice in Mula Nakshatra, with Jupiter and Saturn still in Capricorn. So does this mean it's the end of the pandemic because we have another very similar one, or does it mean that this is where the pandemic really roars? I think it's a little bit of both, because Mula Nakshatra can produce medicines, and we're seeing the news that the vaccines are starting to come to their final stage. However, the virus is going out of control, and the vaccines are going to take a long time to catch up with that and control that. So I believe that you're going to see an increased... the third wave is going to increase. And I think that the original predictions that I gave in these videos, like future of coronavirus or coronavirus, racism, protests, etc., all these videos that I have on my channel about coronavirus, I keep saying that you really don't see the end of the coronavirus pandemic until you get Jupiter out of Saturn's signs, which doesn't really happen until the end of 2021. And sure enough, what I'm reading in the news right now is that the vaccine manufacturers are saying, hey, next winter will be great. So I do see both things happening at once. The virus raging out of control, but the vaccine gets introduced into the formula so that we're bringing it under control at the same time that it's raging out of control. The first point is that this pandemic is signified by the Saturn-Jupiter-Mars conjunction in Capricorn, which occurs in proximity to a southern solstice eclipse. The second point is that the pandemic will flare up whenever those three planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, have mutual contact in Capricorn. And conversely, the third point is it'll clear up when that's no longer possible. And it goes away when it becomes impossible and when the initial conditions are no longer met. The initial conditions are mostly Jupiter being in negative dignity and dominated by malefics in strong dignity. And that situation will start to occur over the course of 2021, but won't really reach full maturity until the beginning of 2022, when Jupiter gets out of Saturn's sign, gets into good dignity by entering Pisces.